Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to welcome you to Volume 2, Chapter...
The Nephilim are coming! The Nephilim are coming! For the love of God, the Nephilim are coming! We got to get a squeegee! Oh, this is going to annoy Terry Hatcher.
Well, yes, welcome to Volume 2, Chapter 7 of Book Talk. Tonight we'll be discussing that unusual book genre, Speculative Science. Please join us, won't you?
Tell you about my best friend. He's a warm-hearted person who loved me till the end. People, let me tell you about him. He's so much fun, whether we're talking man to man.
You don't need to be bigger than life to be a good dad. You just need to spend time with your kids. It takes a man to be a dad.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Book Talk. I'm your host, John Robarts, and tonight we have a very special guest, Chad Strahle.
Hello, John.
Yeah.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks for having me.
Better known to all our friends and neighbors as Azrahn. And tonight we want to look at an unusual aspect of the book world. And going back over the years, I've always been a real student of history. I've enjoyed reading about it, every bit of history. But I've always had a very special fascination for the ancients, you know, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and so on.
It's a fascinating topic.
Absolutely, and even so much into reenacting some of the Roman times and so on. But I think modern man in general has a very distorted view of how developed a lot of those ancient civilizations were.
Well, history is often pinned by the victors, those who have won, and it's from their perspective that it is created and that we're often only exposed to.
Right.
And especially in dealing with the ancient world. You know, in the ancients, and not to sound like I'm going to be cracking on any kind of a religion, but it was, for the most part, the monks that were hand-scribing things, the reason that those particular forms of history even survived. You know, until we have reached our the author of Zechariah Sitchin.
Right.
Which we'll get to in a little bit later. When he started transcribing the cuneiform tablets that went beyond the scope of the control that the monks or the religion dogmas.
Well, it's important to remember, as we go back in history, that there have been several occasions where a great deal of that ancient knowledge was lost. In particular, comes to mind the Great Fire in the Library of Alexandria. And I don't remember the exact year, but that was, I think, early 2nd century or 3rd century, if I remember correctly. And so much of it was lost, but not everything was destroyed because there were copies of other places in the world, so not all that knowledge was lost. But, of course, in those days, copies of a book only numbered in the tens or the hundreds.
Yes, it was far, before Hewlett-Packard's, photo prints and all that. It was, everything was hand-scribed. It took time, and it took fleets of mad maniacal monks.
Anyway, but getting back to the premise, that a lot of people misunderstand how advanced these civilizations were, and it wasn't until the cuneiform tablets were transcribed, or that language was cracked, so to speak, did we understand anything about those very, very ancient people. But if you actually go back and read some of the things that the Egyptians wrote, and some of the things that the Sumerians and the Hittites, those early civilizations wrote, they talk about the heavens in a very different way than we think about it today. They weren't uncomfortable with the idea of there being other lives. Now, they often called them gods, but other beings from the stars, so to speak.
The terms that we use, like in heaven, is not as synonymous with the ancient civilization's term for heaven.
They had a different view of it.
They had a different meaning altogether.
Right.
'Cause in general, we have a tendency of viewing both like heaven and hell as supernatural states, places or planes in which one goes after you've departed. Whereas the heavens to the ancients were the celestial skies.
It was a real place, as real as
exactly,
here and now to
the
them.
heavens was outer space.
Right.
It was the planets in our Milky Way. It was Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Uranus, all of the recorded planets.
Right.
And the fact that they had knowledge of them before even we did. Pluto, we just discovered in 1930. The Sumerians knew about them thousands of years ago.
Right. Well, to get into some books, because after all, this is book talk, I want to mention some interesting books by Eric von Däniken, and the very first one that comes to mind is The Chariots of the Gods. Now, this came out in 1968. All through the late 60s and early 70s, this book was an absolute blockbuster. I recall at the time I worked in a bookstore, and we couldn't keep it on the shelves. It was just flying off the shelves, literally.
Well, it was a pioneering book because of the fact that it was the first one that took the notion of the ancient civilizations out of being nomadic farmers and traders and gave some credence or credibility to the fact that they may have had a technology that has been lost that we did not understand.
Right. He makes a very good case in a lot of places in the book for certain archaeological implications of extraterrestrial visits. Now, he wasn't necessarily the height of scientific integrity.
No, this is true.
He wrote this to make money.
Pulp fiction.
You know, in a sense.
Is what he was hoping for.
And he succeeded. And he had a lot of sequels to it. The Gold of the Gods, Miracles of the Gods, all in the same vein. And all of them are very entertaining reading. And they will make you stop and think about what some of these ancient symbols stood for. I know that recently there was a program on one of the cable channels, one of the the pay channels that dealt with UFO examples in Renaissance paintings and medieval paintings.
I have a sample with me if you'd like to see.
Absolutely, and trying to explain some of that. Of course, we don't have an easy explanation for any of it.
No, actually, we're just starting to. Modern science is just now beginning to accept the possibility that the ancients were amongst the stars. Here's a couple samples. That's from a cuneiform tablet. That will indicate a bit of the possibility of it being a space rocket.
Let's see if we can actually get a shot of this, perhaps. And let me adjust this a little bit here and try to be still. And if you look on the left of your screen there, you'll see an animal and then a couple of symbols next to it would look an awful lot like rockets with exhaust, and to the very right of the symbol on the left, you see a winged object. Doesn't really look much like a bird. The fact that they wrote these things, that they came up with it, is fascinating. This one's a little harder to see, but we'll make one more stab if the camera could come in and give us a shot. And you'll see right at the very top of the image, you see another one of those little rocket-shaped images. And these are Sumerian from approximately 3000 BC, if I remember correctly. And, I'm not going to tell you that I believe it's one way or the other. I don't know. I think it's important that we consider it, that we ask the question, was there contact?
The only absolute fact that we can guarantee or be 100% certain of is that there are several anomalies that have existed from the beginning of recorded civilization that we have never been able to properly address or comprehend or understand. And it's only been since the modern times, since the advent of the computers and being able to analyze such data, when we're starting to realize that there may have actually been an overwhelming missing chunk that we're not seeing.
Right.
It's like we've seen some of the little things. Like if our society was destroyed at this moment and you advance it 500 or 600 years, what's going to be remaining?
Oh, exactly.
You're going to have a bunch of stone walls. You're going to see a lot of the same kind of ruins that are remaining.
Well, anytime you go look at a junkyard, you see an automobile from 50 years or 60 years ago, you see how badly it's rusted down to next to nothing, how quickly those things deteriorate.
Exactly.
The archaeology that has been done in this part of the world has just been amazing, the things that have been preserved. But it's such a tiny, tiny portion of the whole that it really makes it difficult to say that it was exactly this way or exactly that way. And of course, that's the job of the archaeologist. And von Däniken in his books, he didn't really stay true to the archaeological rigor of science. You know, it's speculative, but it's fascinating. And I think it's a good place to start with.
And that's exactly what I think was on his mind when he published that, to get people to start to question the norm, to start saying there is more out there. We don't have all the answers, but stop accepting it as if we already had.
Right, exactly. And from that, he did a good job. It is still fairly easy to find these. I'm not sure. I think that Chariots of the Gods might still be in print. I need to double check that to be certain.
It may
but there are plenty copies out there to find. The other one's a little tougher to find.
Also, don't forget to check out your local libraries.
Oh, absolutely. Anyway, we're coming close to a point where I'd like to go ahead and insert a bookmark. And when we come back, we want to talk about a much more rigorous scientist, Zecharia Sitchin, and his books. And
the Earth Chronicles.
The Earth Chronicles. And we'd appreciate it if you'd stay with us and come back for a little more book talk.
Turn the world on with a smile. Well, it's you, girl, and you should know it. Love is all around, why don't you take it? The best way out is by coming in. Going to family learning programs helps you and your family lead better lives. Call 1-877-FAMLIT1 because making it after all shouldn't just happen on TV.
And welcome back. Well, as we went to our little bookmark there, we had mentioned one of the real giants of this particular genre, Zecharia Sitchin. Yeah. And he's an absolutely fascinating author. Now I want to hold up a little graphic here. We have some of the covers of 8 of his books. He's a very, very prolific author. The first one was The 12th Planet. And if the camera could get in there, please, thank you. And The 12th Planet there, The Stairway to Heaven, The Wars of Gods and Men, The Lost Realms, When Time Began, Genesis Revisited, Divine Encounters, and The Cosmic Code. And I believe he has a few other titles, too, as I recall.
He's recently come out with like 2 others, and I'm not familiar with their titles offhand.
Right. But once again, he has done an absolutely phenomenal job of interpreting very, very early archaeology.
He has spent the last 30 years transcribing and translating cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia and ancient Sumer, which was the first recorded civilization. Right. After spending years of transcribing these, he has come up to the conclusion that the ancients possessed a technology that we do not understand, and were tapped into something far greater than being a nomadic farming colony like
right.
most people think of today. Excuse me.
Well, everybody has a certain perception, of the ancients and of their writings as it being just mythology, and it would be irrational, I think, to say that everything they wrote should be taken completely literally. Sure, they had artistic expressions, sure, some of it was mythology, but I think it's also wrong to dismiss it just out of hand. When they tell us that, this object descended from the heavens and this happened and this person came out of that object and so on, that we shouldn't just automatically say, oh, that can't be, because we don't see that happening in our society today. Doesn't mean it didn't happen then. We don't know. We weren't there.
Well, again, when people say it fell from the heavens, some people would ascribe it to being a transcendence from the plane that I was referring to earlier, that most people are looking forward to, like the utopian life after they're dead.
Right.
But the heavens actually meant sky, outer space. So when they said in ancient times that it was falling from the heavens, it means it came out of the sky.
Right. In general, most of those ancient civilizations referred to the afterlife as the underworld.
Yes.
Not as the overworld.
Correct.
That was a very, very clear distinction in their writings, and it was a very different concept. I actually have one of Sitchin's books here, The Stairway to Heaven, which kind of gets into that a bit, you know.
The Stairway to Heaven talks about, well, first of all, in the 12th planet, it contends with the cosmology of the world. In Stairway to Heaven, it starts to get into more of the interactions between the gods, which were a tangible race, not like the individual referred to as God nowadays as an energy source. It was like the father and pioneer behind all religious dogma. It was referring to an actual race of creatures. Mm-hmm. They herald from what they call the 12th planet, and that was coming from the outside end, and that planet's name is Nibiru.
Right. Well, I want to get into something as a slight sidetrack here for a few moments. If you go back to the works of William Lilly, now William Lilly was one of the greatest astrologers who ever lived, and I think it's very important to make the point that up until the 19th century, with Herschel and Lowell and those, that in all of recorded history, astronomy and astrology were both one and the same. They made no distinction between those two arts.
Agreed.
Between the science and the art. It was all the study of the heavens. And whether or not you ascribe any truth to astrology or not is a completely separate issue. But going back and looking at the mathematics used by William Lilly, you can see that he made certain mathematical corrections for the orbits of the outer planets, specifically Jupiter and Saturn, keeping in mind that in that time period in 1647, when he published Modern Astrology, which, by the way, is an absolutely fascinating book, and I recommend you pick it up and read it because it's hilarious in a scary kind of way. Right. But he accounted for gravitational or numerical anomalies that you could not explain except by the presence of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, etc., etc., etc.
There's also another.
And even though he did not directly identify the existence of those planets, you can look at his mathematics and see that he was taking their gravitational tidal effect into account.
Well, we live in a very finite physical realm.
Exactly.
It has its rules, limits, and boundaries. So, and by that statement, you can boil everything down to mathematics.
Right. Exactly.
You can prove that something is there or is going to be there. You don't need to see it.
Right. That leads me on to Percival Lowell, who discovered Pluto, and he worked starting with Lilly's mathematics through the mathematics of Copernicus and so on, through Clyde Tombaugh, and who actually was, Lowell actually finalized the mathematics of the existence of Pluto, and Clyde Tombaugh actually got the photograph which proved its existence. And up until that took place, which if I recall correctly...
Pluto was officially discovered in 1930.
Yeah, 1930, yeah. There was still a tremendous debate. Oh, there can't possibly be another planet. You know, Neptune's the last one. There can't possibly be. But the mathematics proved it. And mathematics today are showing us that there are other bodies beyond that.
Correct.
And they have just within the last year discovered another orbiting body beyond Pluto, which I don't think they've come up with an official name yet, but they actually have that. A body that the astrologers have been tracking, I know, since at least the 1600s.
And it is also one of the most controversial topics out there at this time.
Right.
Because of its significant ramifications. But before we go much more into that, understand that Zecharia Sitchin started to realize they were, through the cuneiform tablets, that they were not talking about a mythical god. They were talking about a race of creatures. Right. And in his books also explored the possibility that they, in fact, created us in their image. Don't want to go too heavy onto the theological aspects, mind you.
Right, right.
And again, Zecharia
looking just at the archaeological record.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Sitchin was much more astounded and much more fascinated with the cosmological ramifications than he was ever to do with the theological or dogmatic implications. Right. And I guess that gives him a lot of credibility in a lot of ways.
Right.
He started tracking the 12th planet, and again, it was called Nibiru, which that supposedly a race of creatures called
the Nephilim,
refer to themselves as the Anunnaki. Now, in the Bible of the Old Testament, you're referring to the Nephilim, and they speak of a race of angels. It very possibly could be these people.
Right. So there could be some parallels and some certain amount of cross-referencing between those ancient works, which lends a lot of credence to that point of view. The great thing that Sitchin has done is to extract a view of the world that was completely unexpected.
Yes.
That was perhaps shoved under the carpet, so to speak, by a lot of classical archaeologists who don't want to shake the theological boat or to challenge what people believe.
There are many that believe that there is not one original icon in the entire Christian faith.
Well, once again, that's getting into that whole theological thing. And I don't necessarily want to hammer that because, it really isn't my point to try to challenge people believe.
That's not...
But ultimately, it's what is the historical truth?
Yes.
And that's the thing.
That's exactly where I'm going with as well.
Yeah.
Now, again, it's not that I have no intention of attacking religion on this one, okay? But the reason I say that is because Very Heart and the cuneiform tablets also verify all of the books that are in the Bible, all of the stories that we've taken home. Mm-hmm. Yet they're very similar. All of the great cultures of our history have to do with a major flood and a deluge.
Right.
They're starting to uncover evidence of that, including within the Sphinx. There are layers within the Sphinx that have seashells.
Right,
At some point in time, that the Sphinx was completely underwater, and that's where I was heading with that. No, again, theology is a personal choice. It's a personal expression.
Right.
Okay? It doesn't coincide as much with history as they would like to believe, and that's all wonderful. Now, what Sitchin was doing is trying to uncover what happened in our history.
Right.
And there's a very distinct possibility that what actually transcribed is much different than we know now.
Oh, precisely. And he hasn't gone down that sensationalism road so much as the early authors like von Däniken did. He's made a very intense effort to try to stay focused on the facts and to propose not just necessarily one interpretation, but several of them. But he makes a good case for a particular interpretation that we have interacted with other extraterrestrial species in ancient times. And, when you look at the archaeological record going back beyond 3000 BC, going back beyond 6,000 years, there's nothing to speak of. And it seems like civilization just pop, there it is.
Yes.
And that's hard for the archaeologists and historians to explain. I mean, it's one of the great mysteries of history.
And here's another really neat one for you. The geneticists suddenly popped onto the frontier just a few years ago.
Oh, right.
The sudden realization that every living organism on this planet has 48 chromosomes, except for one. Can you guess who that one is?
Well, I would think mankind.
Pretty much. We have 46.
I'd have to get into the actual biological research there because I seem to remember it being a little bit different. But the writings of these ancient people, I don't think we should just dismiss them as complete fantasy, as complete mythology. There had to be something about it that bore some fact, something that motivated them to write this way.
Perhaps one of the most scariest views that one could take is that everyone talks about the Bible being metaphorical and allegorical. What if it wasn't an actual detailed account?
What if it isn't allegorical at all? What if it's factual?
Right.
But of course, that story has undergone so much revision and so much rewriting through history. I mean, you can actually look at some of the comparative texts that have been published recently where they have the Aramaic, the Latin, the Greek, and the English all side by side. And if you have any understanding of those other languages, you see how much difference there is in the interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely. Words don't always add up as perfectly as mathematics do.
Exactly. But going back to Sitchin's math, and in the cuneiform texts, you don't have that constant revision, that constant historical rewriting. You don't have the Council of Nicaea. You don't have the Council of Trent. You don't have the Vatican interpretation. You don't have the Vatican destroying records. You don't have the great, horrendous book burning that took place under Constantine when he converted the Roman Empire to Catholicism.
Yes.
Or the great loss of the fire at the Library of Alexandria. Here we're going back to a record that has been essentially undisturbed for 5,000 years.
Exactly.
And that's fascinating.
Yes, and it also verifies a lot of what is being handed down to us today.
Right.
There's a few added little things that have been going, let's just not look there.
Right.
Probably one of the reason that the Earth Chronicles are so controversial, and again, it's not theologically based.
Right.
It has become about the planet Nibiru.
Right.
Because if it is as straightforward as they are stating, then it is also stating that Nibiru also contained an additional life form. Whether it being superior, inferior, that's not the point of this. The historical notes indicates that there was a very active life form there. Right. The next point is that when will it approach?
You have a graphic, I believe, of the orbital pattern. Now, according to Sitchin and his interpretation of the of the works of the Sumerians, there exists another planet that has a very, very eccentric orbit.
3,625-year orbital pattern.
And that's not necessarily, beyond the realm of possibility. It would be very difficult to photograph it because you'd have to know its exact position. And there are certain mathematical anomalies with the orbits of the inner planets that show us that this may exist and that it's a very large planet, and this could account for the creation of the asteroid belt, which so far they haven't come up with a good explanation for.
According to ancient Sumeria, the planet that we inhabit now that we refer to as Earth was at one time called Tiamat, the great dragon. It also describes of the great slayer Marduk approaching. Many believe that Marduk is in fact Nibiru.
So that was that's one of those words that just tears me up.
Anthropomorphic?
Yeah, anthropomorphization, blah, blah, blah. That, or a allegory. That's what I'm looking for. An allegory of the actual planets using these animals, these creatures, as a means of telling the story. So there's always some truth under any myth. There's always something going on there.
But what it describes is interstellar collision.
Right.
And what it according to Sitchin, it also explains some of the anomalies in our own Milky Way galaxy, like the asteroid belt. Yep. Which is the exact path of where Nibiru approaches. At one time, Nibiru slammed into us, and that's where we got the moon. Again, according to the cuneiform translations.
And going back to some of the mathematics, this actually has some relationship to the pole shift, the magnetic pole shifts that Earth has demonstrated archaeologically.
That gets right into the heart of the actual controversy and what has become sweeping the net with what is known as Planet X.
Right.
Zechariah Sitchin never once, no matter what a few of the flim-flam artists will tell you, has given any kind of a date of a potential arrival of Nibiru.
Right, but simply that it's possible.
It is simply not listed, or if it is, has not been stated.
Right. Well, anyway, we're coming up toward the end of our time segment here, and I wanted to mention briefly that you do have a website.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hopefully we've got that graphic and we can run that with a little bit of luck. And there you are. There's a website right there. And you can find out a lot more about this subject from that website. And you can also reach our guest here. And, by all means, if you want to get into this, Zechariah Sitchin, to be honest with you, the very first book was a little bit of a hard read.
Yeah,
it was very technical. But the follow-up books are much easier. Once you get through the first one, you've got the groundwork, and you can have a real enjoyable read with it.
In the 12th planet, he was going for cosmology. He released the Genesis Revisited, which is more of a layman's term, and explores the book Genesis in a much easier to understand. And ponder are some of our mythological stories that we've taken to heart.
Okay, fascinating. Well, we've enjoyed having you on board.
Well, thank you.
And we hope to have you back again sometime.
I'd be happy to.
And we've enjoyed talking to you about some speculative science, and we believe there might be some more truth there than you might imagine. But please come back again sometime soon for some more book talk.